Brigadier General Irvin McDowell was placed in command of all federal troops in and around the Union capital of Washington, D.C. Under pressure from the North, Lincoln ordered McDowell and his army of 35,000 soldiers to attack rebel troops in Virginia. On July 21, 1861, the first major battle of the Civil War took place just 20 miles southwest of Washington in the town of Manassas near a stream called Bull Run. Union troops might have broken through Southern lines had it not been for the heroics of the rebels led by General Thomas J. Jackson. His 5 regiments held back the Union troops by creating an impenetrable wall of men atop a hill above the battlefield. Union troops could do nothing but retreat back to Washington in defeat, and the legend of Stonewall Jackson was born. While the people of the Confederacy celebrated their great victory, Lincoln realized that the war would not end as quickly as he had hoped. Lincoln replaced McDowell with General George B. McClellan and appointed him General-in-Chief of all Union forces. By the end of 1861, the end of the war seemed nowhere in sight. 1862 would see the Union victory at the Battle of Shiloh, but at a cost of 24,000 lives on both sides. Confederate General Robert E. Lee and his army of Northern Virginia would win the 7 Days Campaign and save the capital of Richmond from capture. A second battle at Bull Run would once again see an outnumbered rebel army defeat Union troops. On September 17th, McClellan and Lee once again met along the banks of Antietam Creek near the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. Fighting continued for 14 hours. When the Battle of Antietam finally ended, over 3,600 Union and rebel troops were dead and another 18,000 were wounded. It was the bloodiest single day of the Civil War, but the North had won, and Lee and his beleaguered troops marched back to Virginia. On September 22nd, President Lincoln announced his plan to end slavery once and for all. With the stroke of a pen, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This presidential order promised freedom to all slaves in Confederate territory beginning on January 1, 1863. From that moment on, the Union Army had 2 goals: to restore the Union and to abolish slavery forever. With the urging of black abolitionist Frederick Douglass in May of 1863, black federal troops saw battle for the first time, and on June 7th they would see their first victory when they defeated Confederate soldiers at Milliken's Bend in Louisiana. In June of 1863, General Lee moved into Pennsylvania with his Army of Northern Virginia. After marching north for many weeks, they came upon the small town of Gettysburg. On July 1st, Southern troops encountered Northern troops and the fighting began. By the next morning, 65,000 Confederates were pitted against 85,000 Union soldiers in the Battle of Gettysburg. For 2 long days, the fighting continued. At one point, the Union line stretched for 3 miles. On the afternoon of July 3rd, Lee ordered General George E. Pickett to attack the center of the Union position with his divisions. 15,000 Confederate soldiers marched across 400 yards of open ground to face the entrenched Federal troops. Pickett's charge would be Lee's final gamble to win the battle, but it failed. Only half of Pickett's men made it back to Confederate lines. When the 3-day battle was over, more than 50,000 men were either killed, wounded, or missing. It was the bloodiest battle of the Civil War, and it was the last time that Lee would set foot in the North. The tide of the war was turning to the North's favor. On November 19, 1863, President Lincoln went to Gettysburg for the dedication of a national cemetery. His speech was short but profound. 70 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He concluded his speech by calling for the war to continue so that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. In March of 1864, Lincoln appointed Ulysses S. Grant General-in-Chief of all Union armies. General William Tecumseh Sherman became commander of Union troops in the Western Campaign and started his march to capture Atlanta, Georgia. In August of 1864, the Democratic Party nominated George B. McClellan for president to run against Lincoln in November. Lincoln desperately needed Union victories to secure his re-election. On September 2nd, General Sherman's forces captured Atlanta. Rebel forces abandoned the city and headed south. It was the Union's greatest victory of the year. On November 8, 1864, Abraham Lincoln was re-elected President of the United States with 55% of the popular vote. A week after the election, Sherman set fire to Atlanta and began his march to the sea across Georgia. By December 21st, Sherman had reached Savannah, leaving a path of destruction in his wake. Once he reached the sea, Sherman and his troops began his advance to Virginia. The Civil War was now entering its final year. By the beginning of 1865, only Virginia and the Carolinas remained in the fight against the powerful North. On March 4, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated for a second term. With Union victory in sight, he offered words of reconciliation to the wounded South. With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. On April 2nd, General Grant's forces broke through Lee's lines at the Battle of Petersburg. Lee and his men evacuated the city. The following day, the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, was captured by Federal troops. Grant and his army continued to pursue Lee. Lee and his remaining troops reached the village of Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Grant's army soon had them surrounded. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered his army to General Ulysses S. Grant. On April 14th, the United States flag was flown once again over Fort Sumter. That same evening, Lincoln and his wife Mary went to Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. to see the play Our American Cousin. During the third act of the play, an actor and Southern loyalist named John Wilkes Booth shot the president in the back of the head with a pistol. The following morning, Lincoln was dead and became the first president to be assassinated in office. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton was quoted as saying, "Now he belongs to the ages." 11 days later, John Wilkes Booth was shot and killed in a tobacco barn in Virginia. By May, the remaining Confederate forces had surrendered to Federal troops and the Civil War was finally over. More than 620,000 Americans died in the long, bloody war. For more than a decade, the South was put under Northern control during a period known as Reconstruction. The Civil War had torn the United States apart and pitted brother against brother. It took the courage of President Abraham Lincoln to hold this nation together, whatever the costs. For his heroic crusade to unite the nation and free the slaves, he gave his life and became the Civil War's greatest martyr.